damaging relationships can be very addictive. It's what you know. And it's quite interesting because I used to say the mother would come in with her children, and in the first day she's so busy settling in, getting her social security sorted out. And then day 2, she's beginning to make her friends. Day 3 is when the adrenaline drops, the high of living always in a state of hyper excitement because you just never know what's next going to happen in the family. Right. And that's the moment when she's most likely to go back. Not because she wants to be battered. That's not true. It's simply because, in a sense, in such a high state of agitation that it's almost easier to go back where you know where he is and what he's doing.
Hello. So I've been reading a book of yours that you wrote in 2011, This Way to the Revolution, a Memoir, and I very much enjoyed it.
Good.
I'm going to just introduce my guest a little bit, not very much, because she can speak for herself and has a wonderful sense of humor. So I think we'll enjoy this conversation. So first of all, Ms. Pizzey has published 10 fiction books and 3 nonfiction books that have become cult classics. Scream Quietly or The Neighbours Will Hear, which is very funny, in 1974, Prone to Violence in 1982, and The Way to the Revolution, This Way to the Revolution, a Memoir, 2011. I would like maybe, if you don't mind, just to start and tell everyone where you're born and who your parents were, and then we'll get on to more interesting issues at hand. So go ahead and tell people where you were from. And
I have a twin sister. I was born in Tsingtao. In those days, it was called Tsingtao in China. Mm-hmm. And we were on the last boat out of China when the Japanese formed a pact with Germany, and suddenly we were all arrested. And we were very lucky because we weren't put in the camps. All our friends were, but my father was a diplomat. So we were hostages, and we were on this boat out of China, and then we were exchanged for hostages in South Africa. And then we were refugees for quite a long time in South Africa. My father went up to Beirut, where he was posted, and we spent a sort of very peripatetic life, really, moving every 2 years. Finally ended up in England at the age of 9, and we were put into boarding schools, and my parents went off again. And my brother was 7 then, and he was put into a boarding school. Mm-hmm. And we didn't really see them for about 2.5 years, which, to be honest with you, was a great relief for me, because my mother really hated me. And she's always said that I was born to be hanged.
You hate all of you kids.
No, my twin sister, who looked like her,
mm-hmm.
she was fine with her. I looked like my father, and she hated my father.
Oh, I see.
It was one of these things where, I talk about addictive relationships. My father was totally addicted to my mother. She was cruel. She was nasty about him and to him. But she wanted to stay, because I said to her when she was dying, why are you in this relationship? She said, for you and what I could give you, which of course was not the truth at all. Mm. She was there because she would have all the servants and the big houses, and because he was a consul. Right. And that's really why she was there.
Now, was she interested in his diplomatic work?
No, not at all. Oh, the only thing I would say for her, because she taught me, she gave very good parties, which you have to do if you're a consul's wife. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that she was just really a party woman. But then, having said all that, when I got old enough to look at her background, I realized why she was as she was. And with that kind of understanding comes compassion.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Absolutely. I've done some work with my family in the last few years too that's been, freeing. It's been freeing, right? It frees you up.
Yes, it is. It
to
does.
love and to be generous and kind. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm. So tell us a little bit about your dad, because he sounds like he was quite a character.
He was a appalling bully and very cruel.
Oh, so you had a rough time.
Yep. And he was the youngest of a huge Irish family. And he used to, every Christmas it would set him off, and he'd go on about how he had to go to school with holes in his pants and holes in his shoes. And as a child, you just get very bored with it all. But later on, you realize, and again, with understanding, that he was the youngest, I think, or almost the youngest of this massive family. And he did do his homework by candlelight, and he did go to school not properly dressed at all. But he worked so hard, and he was a genius. And so what happened is, when the time came, he took the civil service exams. And at that point, grammar school boys didn't really get those top civil service exams. It was more private school, what we call public schools. But he came out on top, and that's how he got into the Foreign Office.
I see. Yeah, so he came from a family of 17 siblings, right?
Yes, and he was one of the youngest. And a lot of this is the thing, the tragedy that happened to him, in that of those 17, in those days, of course, because there was no money in the family, 7 died. And being a good Catholic family, they made all the children stand round those deathbeds and watch their siblings die. And that affected him hugely, as you can imagine. Because when my mother died, he did the same to us.
Right.
And it was the most disturbing thing that you could ever do to children.
Oh, that's why he did that. I wondered why he did that. So he kept your mum in the house after she died for a number of days, right?
6 days. I checked that with somebody who's still in Axminster who remembers. Actually, the village still remembers what happened. But that isn't what I felt bad about, because, again, with time comes understanding. But what I did, it changed my life. Miss Williams, who ran this holiday home where we went to for years, she was the local JP. She could have stopped him. She came to visit, walked into the dining room where my mother was mouldering away and smelling, walked out and left us. Our doctor, who knew the family well, my father insisted he came in to clarify that she was dead. He did that. He said, this shouldn't be happening to a dog, and walked out and left us. The people across the road, who knew our family very well, they knew what was happening. They left us. We were left. We were 14, and my brother, he was about 6 or 7, in this house for 6 days with a rotting corpse. And every night he'd make us look. And as the days passed, obviously she changed.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I know. But what it did for me, it was that moment when I realized nobody would help us. And it gave me the courage, probably, to go and do things that nobody else would do.
Yeah, I imagine it was a pivotal moment, that.
Well, because nothing could be as bad as that, I thought.
Right.
So in a way, you can only go up.
And so then you said you were in a boarding school, and your parents were off. They were held by Mao for...
Yes, they were captured by the communists in Tin Sin, which is why I was so anti-communist. And because when my father came out, he was very badly damaged by the experience. They were very lucky in that they were under house arrest. All the rest of them, and some of the families, the men came out having lost their mind because they were tortured. So in a sense, we were lucky. And my mother came out first, and I'd actually forgotten that she had a Canadian accent. I remember this nun saying, "Oh, this is your mother on the phone," and I screamed it down the phone, "You're not my mother. You don't speak English." Anyway, then she came out first, and then my father came out. And it was interesting because she absolutely hated my father, and she taught us to hate him. But it wasn't difficult. He was a bully.
Right.
And as well as stupid things like he'd say to my brother, "Take your shoes off, your feet smell." And he was only a young boy. Yeah. That kind of really awful. Both of them were very, very badly damaged. I remember I was roller skating with this young lad called Chippy, and I fell and broke my arm. I broke my wrist, and you could see the bones sticking out. And so he ran home to tell her, and she sent a message back saying, "There's nothing wrong with your legs, walk."
Wow.
Yeah, they weren't nice people, because it's the old thing, isn't it? I mean, if you abuse children, unfortunately, they tend to grow up to repeat the patterns that you've learned.
Yeah. They
And
tend to.
I was
Don't
lucky
always,
because
but they tend to, right?
yeah, but I was
Hmm.
lucky because I had what I've always said is necessary. I had a mentor. And when I went to this holiday home, there was Miss Williams. She was probably, I think she was nearly 7 feet tall. She was really tall and enormous. She must have weighed God knows how much. But she spent the war driving ambulances. She was a golf champion. She was the local magistrate. And I looked at this woman and thought, that's who I want to be. And so I've
Yeah.
always tried to be a mentor to all
Yeah.
the children going through the refuge and all the work that I've ever done and still do.
So isn't that something that you really need? You need one person, though. You need someone to look up to,
That's
right?
right. Someone,
You need a guide.
that's why I remember in America, there was a wonderful organization called, I don't know, it wasn't Boys and Girls, it was something like that. And they would adopt children in trouble, each the boy and the girl, and become their mentors. And we need more of that. We should have it. Unfortunately, it disbanded, but this is what we need.
Yeah, we
I
have
always had
brothers, big brothers and big sisters.
big brothers and sisters. That they were
Yeah,
brilliant.
yeah,
And I
that's
was in the
very good.
refuge. I always had men working in the refuge, to me and to the mothers, because they voted to have men coming in to work with the
So
kids.
in 1971, that's when you opened your first refuge, right?
Yeah, no, I didn't open a refuge. I opened a community centre
Okay.
for mothers and kids because I was isolated because my husband was in television, so I didn't see much of him. And I just thought there should be a place where we can all meet instead of just meeting in each other's kitchens, because you only met your own strata. You never could meet, other people were doing different things. So I got a house from Hounslow at a peppercorn rent. It was tiny, 2 up and 2 down. And honestly, within a couple of weeks, the door went and I went downstairs and there was this mum with her 2 kids. And I said, where have you come from? She said, I've come home to Southampton, which is quite a way away. And I just said, come in. Well, what else could you say? And that was the beginning. Kathy was the first woman that actually came in. I remember her. And within a matter of weeks, it was just packed to the ceiling. Women and kids. The kids lying on the floor on mattresses and women with them. And the other women would sit up against a wall with their head on their knees to sleep. And we had a kitchen. We had an outside loo. And we all cooked. We got free food from the local people around us. And we cooked a big lunch for everybody. Anybody could come in and get a free lunch. And we sort of evolved, into a big community. And then
You brought men in to work so that they would have a good idea of what a good man was like, because a lot of these women had come from abusive families, right?
Well, it breaks my heart because the refuge movement won't allow any men either on the board because they're feminists or in the refuges.
Right.
I think that's shocking. And boys over 12, this is the bit that both upsets me most. Boys over 12 can't go into refuges. And I think any refuge who's practicing that should have its funds withdrawn. It's the only way to stop it because it's a $1 billion industry that feeds the feminist movement and always has, because they hijacked it in 1974, and I knew it was going to happen because I'd been thrown out of the English women's movement.
How come?
Well, because I kept saying to them, how can you possibly say that men are irrelevant or that men are dangerous and all these things that you say about men, when none of that's true? And I said it on platforms and I fought with them till that point where I got this letter from the Women's Liberation Office banning me from all collectives. I know it sounds funny, but it's deadly serious.
Yes, right.
Really
and then after that, after the Women's Liberation Association, after they ousted you from that, then you began to investigate another association for families and children. Yes?
Yes. And it started off, we called it Chiswick Women's Aid because it was in Chiswick. And Women's Aid because we were there to help women, particularly women whose husbands were in prisons and places like that. But then as the women came in and they were battered women and they needed protection, we changed. And eventually, because I recognized very quickly, thanks to my own background, that my mother was just as dangerous as my father. So I said, listen, this is not a gender issue. And because I could see what was happening as the feminist movement organized themselves to hijack the funding, which they did very successfully, because, all women are victims of male violence, was the mantra of the women's movement. And that point, I don't know, it's not as bad now, but certainly in the 70s and 80s, everything in the publishing world, in the media world, was all feminist women. So my one lone voice couldn't be heard.
Right.
Even now.
And now it's gone into the school systems and into big business, into HR, and it's everywhere.
But shocking, because the figures, the academic figures show that the figures are equal. It isn't a numbers game. If you are born into a violent family, then the likelihood of you becoming violent yourself is very high. If you're lucky like I was and you can transcend because you have a mentor, that's the only hope I can offer, and that we all need to offer, because the intervention will make the changes.
Right. So those big sisters and big brothers are very important.
Yeah.
Stepping stone for people.
But you have to remember that in a strange way, certainly the women's movement have no interest at all in healing the wounded, because that'll affect their income. And in England, I think it's something like 300 million a year they get. Mm-hmm. That's an awful lot of money. And most of it doesn't get to the refuges.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's the problem with these movements is once they get so big, then people get greedy, and then it's all about the money. And it's not about the people anymore.
No, it's quite right.
And it definitely is about people.
Sorry.
It's not about the people anymore. It just isn't. You can tell.
Yeah. Well, you can certainly tell, because the first thing you notice, we all worked in the refuge. Well, in the present situation, they have great big offices in the city that cost a fortune. Mm-hmm. And that's when you know the money's being mishandled.
Right, because I think you went from the 2 up, 2 down to a hotel that had 45 rooms that had been...
That was the first move. The first move was a man walking in, sitting on one of the mattresses and saying, "What do you want?" And we all sat round and we said, "We need a bigger house." And he said, "Well, go and buy one." So we looked at this man, and he actually owned Bovis, which was a huge firm. And we went down, the mothers and me, to the local estate agent, and we found the great big house that we moved to. But we were allowed 36 others.
Did he buy that for you?
He bought it for us, yeah.
Oh, that's nice. Mm-hmm.
But you know what's a strange thing?
What?
A lot of millionaire men got involved, and they helped buy all sorts of things. And the next move, you're quite right, we squatted the Palm Court Hotel, which had 47 private suites, and it was on the river.
What a day that must have been, hey?
I think for all women, because it was on national news, who were stuck at home with brutal husbands. But I keep saying we're not just talking about women, men as well. But at that point, I didn't have a men's house because I was inundated with women and children. And we became the biggest squatting agency in England. We owned streets. We owned all sorts of things. And for all that time, I was packed to go to jail, because whatever we did, even the Palm Court Hotel very quickly got overcrowded. And I kept saying to the borough, look, if you help us get sufficient accommodation, we don't need to be overcrowded. But no woman in the refuge would dream of turning away another mother and children, because they know as well as I do that way they could be killed.
I had, you had a few stories in your book about women showing up with their kids battered and bruised.
Yeah.
And you also talked about the difference between someone who'd come who was battered and bruised, but when you look back at how they grew up, then you would realize if the woman would go back again to that husband. And there was different problems. There was the problem of just being abused and getting out of it, but the problem of being abused as a child, growing up, finding an abuser, marrying them, and then coming to you, and you knowing that there was an attraction between those two?
Not an attraction, it's an addiction.
An addiction, right.
Yeah, because it's something I've been talking about because nobody really thinks about it. But relationships, damaging relationships, can be very addictive. It's what you know. And it's quite interesting because I used to say the mother would come in with her children, and in the first day she's so busy settling in, getting her social security sorted out. And then day 2, she's beginning to make her friends. Day 3 is when the adrenaline drops, the high of living always in a state of hyper excitement because you just never know what's next going to happen in the family. Right. And that's the moment when she's most likely to go back. Not because she wants to be battered. That's not true. It's simply because she is, in a sense, in such a high state of agitation that it's almost easier to go back where you know where he is and what he's doing. Right. What she has to learn, first of all, she's got to learn to trust somebody. Because if as a child, she's come from a very violent background herself, she's never trusted anybody. Mm-hmm. And we need to talk about addictive relationships. You know, sometimes when a mother would come in.
Freud, right? You read Sigmund Freud extensively.
Yeah, but I knew Anna Freud.
And knew Anna Freud, yeah.
Yeah, she was amazing. I remember asking her, because I had a lot of boys, adolescent boys living with me and growing up with my son. And my boys, not the girls so much, but the boys, they'd sleep all day and be up all night. And I remember saying to Anna, I don't know what to do with them, you know, because they're not going to school. She said, leave them alone. She said, this is when they're developing their inner worlds. And we as a society put the most important thing we think, which is education, which is not. The most important thing is that people are allowed as children to grow their inner worlds. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always thanked her for that.
Mm. Yeah, and so why did you read all of Sigmund Freud? Because you had a chance to get library books once every 2 weeks, and you chose Sigmund Freud as your
always.
Yeah.
Yes. I found what he had to say. Not all of it, but he is somebody who understood human beings. Mm-hmm. And Jung. I mean, I read everybody I could get my hands on.
You read Jung too. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yes, very important. And I was lucky because I was actually, my husband was posted, and we were living in Cornwall, so nothing happens in Cornwall in our little village. So the library used to come around every 2 weeks, and I could take 10 books. So I read everything I could extensively. I still do. I mean, reading's my drug of choice. Mm-hmm. And writing, of course.
Yeah, I married someone who's just like that. You know?
Yes.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. When he was a little kid, I met him when he was 8, and his head was always in a book. Always. Oh. It's always been that way. Yeah.
He's a lovely man. I enjoyed meeting him. I felt very honored.
I saw you meet him, but I didn't know who you were. Yeah, it was quite an event, and well, it was wonderful. I'm so glad that I got to meet you because, wow, the things that you've done, and the understanding that you have is what we need right now. We need our mothers and our grandmothers to give us guidance, right? And yeah. I think you're here to guide us. So one of the questions, because your lady named Hannah gave me a bunch of questions to ask you, so I'm going to ask you. Let's see. First of all, she said Erin's incredible courage is drawn from her faith.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
I don't think we have faith we don't have courage without it, because there's, because we're not enough. I'm not enough without my faith, for sure.
Well, I have this cross, and what I do when I get frightened, sometimes on the door of the refuge, and there'd be a man there threatening me, and I just clutch my cross and pray as I was talking to him. And you remember, I don't know if it was in the book, but there was one man, I'll never forget him. He was huge. Yeah. And his mum was she was inside, and he was just threatening and very frightening. And I just said to him, do you realize that you're potentially divine? And his eyes just filled with tears. I'll never forget that. And he walked off.
Oh my, wow. But where did you get, I know that you got the courage probably to stand in front of him from your faith, but
also, I think it's true too. I was terrified of my father. All three of us were. And I always said, I'd never be that frightened by anybody again. The only thing is, I obviously did get frightened because I have these jade bangles and you could hear them clattering because I was shaking.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it, that my father was a bigger than life person, right? He was the man about town, the biggest guy in town, the very boomy voice, and always teasing everybody and making them feel small, actually. So kind of a bullying type. But I learned though that he gave me courage. He gave me courage to just get out there and do what I need to do. I've had to rethink of who he was in order to realize the blessing I had to have him as my father. So that's very tricky, but we have to dig deep sometimes, right? To dig deep to go back and find out what it was we learned.
Yes.
Because here we are now living this life. How did we get here? And it's a question. It's a question.
I think it's really important to be able, and I used to do this work in the refuge, that we always, when I was talking to the mothers, we would go back to the very, very earliest memory that they had. And then it's like clearing out an attic. And then we'd work together to find out why they ended up as they did, what it was, and the good things that they had. I call those the jewels from your childhood that you can keep and polish. Right. And the rest of it, you have to learn not to keep reliving the past. You have to be able to leave it and move on.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the questions that Hannah asked, I thought this was interesting. 50 years on, Erin first bringing domestic abuse into the open. Why is this still a taboo subject? So
shame. It's interesting because they're different. What I call the genuine battered woman is so embarrassed by what's happened to her and to have to admit, and the failure she feels as a mother and all that. And of the first 100 women that came into the refuge, 62 were as violent or more violent than the men they left, the partners, including lesbian relationships, which is the most violent of all, which is interesting.
Yeah. And when you say violence, though, what do you mean by women's violence? Do you mean the
physical violence? There can be both. I mean, it can be physical, certainly. And as one woman said to me, Erin, because we were talking about men's strength if there's a fight, and she said, yes, but knives are a great leveler. And she'd murdered her husband and got off because women don't get held responsible for murder. Mostly they get away with diminished responsibility or self-defense. Yes.
Women are very good at verbal abuse, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And we're even with men. But we dole out verbal abuse with,
yes,
with ease.
But women in many ways, we can batter men verbally in a way that they can't.
Yeah. Isn't that something? True. It's like men, they won't go below this. Like they won't go, but whereas women will go below. We'll go as deep as we can to
and press the right and press the right buttons.
Yeah, abuse. Huh? It's
it can be so. My father used to sometimes come back from the office, steaming into the house, with smoke coming out of his ears, yelling and screaming at my mother, and we were horrified, and we'd shake and cry and all the rest of it. And then when I was older, I was given this wooden crate. We were in Africa, and I was undoing it with a hammer, and out of it came these lovely cashmere cardigans, And I said to my mother, why do we need cashmere cardigans in Africa? She said, oh, one must have cashmere. And that's one of the reasons why my father would come steaming in, because she'd order all this stuff from the Army and Navy in London, and we couldn't even wear it.
Right.
So from that moment onwards, I was much more aware of why my father behaved the way he did.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't just...
I was thinking, my mom was probably nearly 70 years old before I figured it out. She got dementia. And she couldn't speak. And so we gave her some Ritalin to try to help her speak, and it made her paranoid. And she was worried about my father and how my father was fooling around with other women. He was like 70 years old, and he was taking care of her. And he said, I can't take care of your mother if she's going to be talking to me like this. But that was how she talked about him when I was in high school. So I got a glimpse into what she had been like, and I didn't know if it was true or not when I was in high school. But of course it wasn't true. It was her paranoia, or her whatever it was from her own childhood that she had been missing.
Right. Yeah. And it's their reality, isn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, I told him to take her off all the drugs, and then she calmed right down. But
good.
But I finally found out, and then I could heal my relationship with my dad.
Yeah. The other thing too is there is something in women. Men are incredibly loyal on the whole. Okay. But with women, when they get together, the things that they will talk about their husbands or their partners, they leave no stone unturned, and I've always found that despicable, because there's no loyalty there. It's, oh, well, this is what men are like, blah, 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 blah. And I think women have got to learn not to do it, particularly in front of their children.
Well, what was it like at the Refuge then? Because it was all women and children there.
No, because it was always men from the very beginning. So and the only time the men didn't come in, 10 o'clock, the men would take the children off to playgroups, and we as women would all sit together and talk all these things through. And for many of those women, they've never had a voice, never been able to talk, never been able to learn. And it was the most vital part of the intervention for women. And when I started a men's house, that was really important to me to be able to do that. But the difficulty was that where you put a group of women in, and within a matter of a couple of days, they've got everything sorted out, the men disappeared off into the bedrooms and said, well, where's the staff? I said, there isn't any. We haven't got any money. You have to actually act as the staff. They left.
Why do you think that was? What was different about the men?
They weren't prepared to look after each other. I've said to the men time and time again, when I get asked to lecture, why is it that women put women together, and within a short period of time they'll have organized everything, but men won't look after each other, and they don't. That's why there's no men's movement. Why isn't there a big men's movement like there's women's movement across the world? Because men won't look after each other. They look to women to look after them.
Right, and actually men, when they're married to women, they're taking care of their wife and their kids. They don't take care of other men.
No, and even though their wife is probably taking care of her female friends. And it's a very sad part, because it limits men, because they will only actually make their friends through women. Most men's friends are friends of their wives. Majority of men make all their relationships through their wives or girlfriends or partners.
Yeah, my husband has lots of friends, and he brings them all around. But I think he's a different sort of man.
He is. He really is. In a sense, it'd be interesting to know how he was parented.
Oh, his dad was very attentive to him.
Good. You see there?
He said he could come, he would be waiting before he went to school, so he'd be 4 years old or so, waiting for his dad, because his dad was a school teacher, waiting for him to come home, because he knew as soon as his dad came home, he'd lay down on the rug and put his arm out for his son to lay by them, and they'd read a book. And he was so excited. Isn't that nice? That's so
wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
So
I know.
nice. Oh,
I know. Brings tears to your eyes, doesn't it?
Yeah, really. Yeah. And so, and he said that he could never do anything good enough for his dad, but his dad believed he could do anything. So
Yeah.
it was like a double-edged sword he had with his dad.
Yeah.
He said he'd be
But
crying
overall,
if he knew he wasn't good enough, but he wouldn't leave, and neither would his dad. They would carry on, you know?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty special. Huh. We must lose the victim/perpetrator, oppressed mentality. Now that is a deep subject.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was talking about it with Jordan this morning. He told me, he said that oppressor or victim and perpetrator, oppressor, oppressed. So Marxism, and you saw Marxism early
From the
on.
very beginning, the first, I was so excited. We had a journalist called Jill Tweedy, and she was writing in The Guardian, which was left, and even lefter in those days, but about this new emerging women's movement where, women would be good to women. We wouldn't compete any longer. And I just thought this sounded marvelous. So what they asked you to do was to go to a local meeting. And I had never gone out at night without my husband. I've been married for something like 10 years. So I got out my courage and went out. And walking up the stairs to this meeting where this woman was, there were big Mao posters. And I looked at this and I just thought, I can't bear it. This is another communist front. Because my parents were captured by the communists in Tin Sin with my brother. And I think I've told you, and we didn't see them for 3 years. We didn't know whether they were alive or dead for a long time.
I didn't know your brother was also captured, was he?
Yes. Oh, yes. We didn't see him either. Oh. And anyway, so when I got up the top of the stairs, this woman said to me, why are you here? And I said, I'm here because I'm lonely. I've got a husband who's away a lot. I'm on my own. I feel like I'm a single parent family. And I want to be able to meet other women. Not always in each other's kitchens, drinking the ever-present Nescafe. Anyway, she said, oh, this isn't your problem. Your problem is your husband. He oppresses you. So I looked at her and I said, hang on a minute. He goes to work every single day so that I have the luxury of staying home with my children if I choose to. Ah, yes, but you don't realize. And I just looked at her and I thought, you idiot. You brainwashed idiot. And that was that. Then I went up they had an office, the Women's Liberation, in Poland Street, and I was the secretary. So I thought, right, the kids are at school, I'll go and do some work. Got up there and found more of the same. And then they had these great big meetings in Caxton Hall where you could have 1,000 women or even more. And my little group, the Goldhawk Road group, we'd stand up and get screamed at because we said things like, we're happily married and we have children. We think we're lucky. Can you imagine? They all went bananas. You were told that you were sleeping with the enemy if you were living with a man, because there was a very big contingent of lesbians. And later on, when I actually was able to point out that the lesbian relationships are the most violent of the lot. So let's talk about women's violence. But the problem is that the women's movement, as it is today or always was, they don't have a dialogue. They don't argue about anything. It's $1 billion industry and they're not going to upset it.
So we have to talk about it outside of that, I guess, is the only
Yes,
way.
we do. But then as most of even if a woman journalist isn't a feminist, she knows that she has to play the game because otherwise she won't have a job. It's true of lots of situations, actually. It's not as fierce as it was. I don't know if you realize that or you think that. It used to be absolutely terrifying, I thought, that men were considered toxic. Boys were told they were toxic. I was so upset by all this that I went a few years ago and I did, it's a remedial teaching course you can do. And then you can go into the primary schools. And I did that. I went into a primary school for a whole year. And I was given 3 boys. The one boy, it was supposedly the worst boy in the school. And I snuck in my iPad because all the library books were really girl-centered. There's nothing a boy would want to read. And I found a writer who had wonderful books for boys. I always remember the first one was My Brother's Exploding Bottom. Boys loved it. And it was interesting because as soon as I got in there, what I could hear was the teachers, all of them female. The only male in the whole school was the PE teacher. They all were screaming at the boys because the boys were walking out of that. Boys over the age of 9 are not interested. They're just pulling away from their mothers and moving away looking for male substitutes and models. Mm-hmm. And majority of them are all coming in that school from single parent mothers. But there was nothing there for them because it was all women. And the one heartfelt thing is this the worst boy in the school. I absolutely loved him. And it wasn't that long ago, I got an email from him. He was in college and he said, thank you.
No.
So that made my day.
Oh, I bet. Well, you had a number of boys that lived with you in the refuge.
Yes.
One named Cassie?
Cass, yeah. He's Cass, Richard Lewis. There was Mikey, who went on to become Culture Club, our great big pop star, with Boy George. Boy George used to be in my kitchen eating.
Oh, wow.
But he at that point, he'd just come out of Bow Wow Wow and he had no job. Right. And then Cass became Skunk Anansie, which is a heavy metal band. Mm-hmm. And Amos, my son, was in the music business for ages. And he's in America, he's in California now, he's doing internet stuff. He's brilliant. Yeah. And all the boys, and one of my favorite boys, he was going down for the rest of his life. And I'd gone up and stood in front of the judge and said to the judge, if you let me have him for 2 years, I promise. And so the judge said, well, I don't want to make a decision now. I'm going to think about it. Come back next week. So I sent my poor husband in his best suit up, and he said to the judge, yes, my wife said that she will help him. And then he suddenly found out that he had Russ living with us for the next 2 years. So he was a bit shaken by that. And Russ did come and live with us, and he never got into trouble again. He's happily married.
Why do you think that was? Why did the boys do so well with you?
Because I loved them. Mm-hmm. It's such loving, it's such a healing process. And there was, and as far as the boys were concerned, there was no reason other than to be violent and dangerous, because their backgrounds were awful.
Later in your time, I don't know how much later than that, you mentioned that you had other musicians come to the house, such as Roger Daltrey. And
he came to the Refuge. He was brilliant. Pete Townsend was always very supportive, but he didn't come. Roger came, and the drummer who replaced the drummer who killed himself, I think. He was just lovely there, and it was so good for the kids. Roger would come down regularly, and he'd bring records with him, and T-shirts, and all sorts of stuff. And a lot of very interesting people came to visit us, because we were the first in the world. There was nothing like it. And it's funny because, where they'd come in and they'd what they would think they saw was chaos. Because I have this therapeutic chaos theory. Because what we try and do to people is put structures on them. Make rules, regulations. There weren't any in the house except for the ones made by the mothers themselves. Nobody could be evicted from the house unless the mothers wanted the eviction. The rest of us were all volunteers. And we had no say in anything. It was their house. They paid the rent. They made the decision. Because institutions take away all responsibility. So it has to come from within the women and not be structured from the outside. And this way, so many of the women, because they had peer group pressure, and they slept in dormitories. And I remember the health department said, how can you have them sleeping in dormitories? They should be in rooms of their own. And I said, if you genuinely thought you were going to be murdered by your partner, where would you want to sleep? In a room on your own, where you would never know who's outside, or in a dormitory surrounded by other women? It was trying to teach people to think differently, because you have to, in terms of violence, it's a different mindset, understanding. what's likely to happen or not likely to happen. And when people didn't, for instance, the judge, just in one particular case, the judge ordered my mum with 6 kids to go back to her house, or he was going to put the house up for sale. The husband was on a restraining order. By the way, that never stops anybody who's violent. Anyway, she went back, and that night the husband got in and stabbed her to death.
I read that in your book. Yeah, brutal.
Nobody said sorry. The courts never say sorry.
Yeah, you tried to stop that from happening, I remember.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, yeah, but they didn't heed.
No, and they don't. And I remember there were so many times when it was just simply incredibly dangerous. I remember this man, he always said that he'd kill me once he got out of jail because I put him in jail. And the day came when I get this phone call, there he is. I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you. So I said, okay, fine, kill me. You know where I am. He didn't kill me, but what he did is in the court cases, you would go to High Court in the Strand. You would stand outside with your mother of the court, right next to the man who threatened to kill her and tried to kill her. There was no attempt. And so she, this man's wife, got the restraining order. We were leaving, and he stabbed her in the neck.
Oh my! Wow.
He got a knife through the because it's all checked. I don't know where he'd put the knife. Probably somewhere hidden it. But anyway, there it was, and she was, thank God, bless her heart, she was a Jehovah's Witness, and she was trying to write in her own blood, I do not want a blood transfusion. I just said to her, hey, you've got more serious things to think about at the moment.
Yeah,
I know it's black humor, I know, but it's what you need.
Yes, you must have had a lot of humorous moments in your house with all these women who had suffered so much.
Yeah, and that was the saving grace of it all. We had a big sign over the fireplace which said, "The Shekhinah is here," and that's a Hebrew for God. It's God's face, and it's non-denominational. I mean, I don't belong to any church or anything. My relationship between God and me, but it ran on that faith. And even women who didn't have any faith, it permeated that sense of love. And in those days, of course, we were all able to hug each other. God, these days you'd be cast into prison. But that and the men as well. And I remember this psychiatrist coming to visit us, and he was coming out of this little tiny office where people could talk privately. And I gave him a big hug, and he just burst into tears. Because people didn't hug.
Yeah. Well, you might have had a magic hug. Who knows?
Well, I'm a very big woman. So if I hug you, you get really hugged.
Yeah. Well, that'll do it. Maybe. Let's see. How the anti-male feminist agenda impacted gender relation over the decades. I guess we've talked a little bit about that. Anti-male feminist agenda impacted gender. Yeah, that is interesting. What's going on?
Well, what it's done is to produce this huge chasm of hostility between men and women, because many men will say to me, remember there was that movement, MGTOW, men going their own way.
Yeah.
And sad to say.
Yeah.
But absolutely understandable, because a man now knows she only has to pick up the phone and say that she's living in a hostile environment, and he's gone.
Yeah, I know.
So what a lot of feminist solicitors say in America, I think they're called attorneys, what they'll say is, don't waste your time, go for domestic violence. It's the quickest way to get a divorce. And it's called the silver bullet. If that isn't moving fast enough, say he's molested the children. Then he will never see the children again. And that is what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. No, our court system is so anti-male in terms of...
It is everywhere.
Oh, it's terrible.
Because when the women's movement started in 1969 and I was watching it, I warned everybody, but nobody against listeners, that this is what would happen. Because as they got more and more powerful, more and more of them became solicitors or attorneys. And particularly in Italy, a lot of women are judges, and men don't stand a chance. And the result of that is that men are not making relationships with women, and women are complaining. And I keep saying, well, look at your mothers. Look what they've done for you.
Humility would be a little teaspoon of humility would be good.
Yeah, well, there isn't any, you know.
Yeah, I know. Let's see, what did I read about you? Oh, it was just so interesting to read your book. And so, recently, I think it was December 29th, that you went to receive an award
Yes.
and a well-deserved reward. Companion of the British Empire?
Yes, not that we have an empire.
That's what it's called, though, the C.
Oh, it is. Yeah, they all are. Yeah.
So congratulations for that. And
Thank you.
why don't you tell us?
I was absolutely shocked. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have thought, with me fighting with the courts and always being threatened with jail, and every time I was dragged from Acton Magistrates Court to the High Court in the Strand to the House of Lords, who regretfully sent me back to Acton Magistrates Court. And I was told by Acton Magistrates Court if I took any more women and children in, I'd be jailed. And I got to the front door of my refuge after all this, and there was I'll never forget her. There she was with two small boys. I just said, come in. But by that time, they didn't dare jail me because, apart from anything else, apparently all the women governors of the prison said they wouldn't have me because they were afraid of the riots.
So you had a lot of people on your side, but they weren't the
Yes.
people that were necessarily in positions in the bureaucracy.
Well, this is a problem. But yes, I mean, what it was the media that saved me, because especially the Daily Mirror, because they would come out and blast. But the problem really for me was that as far as the establishment, the British establishment, nobody is allowed to disobey. So you get a situation where a judge has decided that, yes, okay, the woman, I told you she was stabbed in the High Court, right? So she was in hospital. And so what do you want to do with the boys? I know that there's going to be 6 black boys, all boys, go into care. And I know what happens to those children in so-called care. So I found an aunt on the islands, and I raised the money, and I forged their passports, and I sent them all back to their aunt. That's why I was in so much trouble, because I didn't obey. There was one point where the judge had decided to hand these children over to a man who'd already murdered a child. And I hid her out in Southern Ireland where there's no extradition. So I was well known to the police and to the establishment. But in all conscience, that has to come first.
Right, and look how it ended up in the end. They gave you an award.
Well, that's why I was so shocked. That's exactly why I never in a million years thought that would happen.
But that just shows you if you follow your conscience, right? If you follow your conscience and you do the next right thing, no matter if it's hard or not, because you don't know how it's going to end up. You don't know.
It's faith. It's knowing that that you say your prayers, and you try to walk on that, what I call, everybody has a shining path. It's God-given. You're born with it. And you try to walk. Okay, you fall off it lots of times. I certainly do. But that's where you should be. And then God will take care of it for you. And not the way you might want it. No. That's it. It's not, yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's an awkward place. So what are your kids up to now? You have 2 children?
I have 2 children, plus all the adopted ones. So my daughter is a social worker, and a very good one. And my son is in America, and he has an internet platform, and he creates events. But I'm lucky because they're both full of faith. Mm-hmm. So and it's such a relief, because sometimes if you say to somebody, God bless you, they get really offended. But in our family, nobody does.
Oh, that's good, isn't it? It gives you some peace to know that your kids
it does.
have a relationship with God. Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same way. I had a conversation with my daughter just yesterday, and she was telling me about her prayer practice and her faith and her husband. It's good.
That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to listen.
Well, it gives you a language, doesn't it? And it gives you not just a language, but also you have an understanding as a family, and it's comforting because you speak the same language.
Yeah. And then you can trust that they are taking care of themselves.
Yes.
The best, no matter what happens, they're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
And so then
I've always said to people, if you can be a good enough parent, that's all anybody can ask of you. because we do judge each other so much. And sometimes, on paper, because social workers would come steaming into the refuge, say, no, of course all right, she's dirty, yeah, and the kids have got mucky faces and or dressed peculiarly, but she loves them unconditionally, and that's all that really matters.
I saw pictures of I saw a little clip of the movie that was made. I didn't see the whole movie, but of all the women lying in sleeping bags, one
On the
by
floor.
one by each other.
Yeah, and that still makes me cry. Yeah.
Oh, that's
that
so
Michael
good.
White's film. Yeah, I put it. It's on the internet. I put it up there for people to be able to see it. They did, and there's it was very, but you could see how relaxed, because they were all sleeping. It isn't as though most of them were sitting up. I mean, they were.
One was sitting up. I think one just wanted a drink. That was it.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the work that you did, absolutely amazing. I think, to put all those people together, those women who were suffering, and those kids who didn't know one another, and there they all are, eating at the table together, and just completely trusting.
I know, and the lovely thing for me is when I get an email from one of the children telling me how they're happily married and they've got children, and you think, wow, they've transcended. Yeah.
What a gift, eh? So you've given so many people gifts for good life. That's got to feel good.
Particularly when you hear from the children, it does. It's that Hebrew word nachas. It means it's happiness. You just feel that warm feeling inside. Whatever they'd been through, and some of them had suffered so terribly and abused and sexually abused, and they transcend. And it honestly isn't difficult. Sometimes you just sit with a woman who is violent herself, and you say, look, let's have a look at the way you respond. So you go straight from frustration to rage. There's another way you can do this. You can trust somebody enough to go from frustration to telling them that you're hurting. And most people can't do that unless they've come from good, warm, loving families, because they'd be ridiculed if in a violent family. That's particularly true of boys and men.
Yeah, there's a lot of relearning that has to happen, because if your response has always been from a place of discomfort to rage, then you haven't had a chance to be in a quiet place for a moment to reevaluate and to see if there's another option, right? So you've never given yourself that chance.
Yeah. Well, and also for many people, they don't know that it's an option, because if a family's violent. I remember if anybody crossed me, I used to do that. I go straight to, and I remember this lovely man called Bill Mitchell. He was a psychologist, and I'd had a nervous breakdown. I'd been in hospital for about 3 months, and he said, I'll help you. So I used to go and visit him, and I went charging in one day, and yummy, 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 this is what happened. And he said, Erin, do you not know any other method of dealing with things other than declaring Third World War? And I looked at him in absolute amazement. The answer was no, I didn't. So I had to learn.
Yeah, resentment. Resentment is the one, I think, that breaks up the families. And
it does, and also because particularly if it's unspoken resentment, because you then act out the resentment in all sorts of different ways.
That's it's sin of omission, I guess, isn't it?
But I guess we all need to learn to communicate. It's in the lack of communications, and so when we're in primary schools, you get to a certain age, and so what do they teach them? Sex, how to put a condom on a banana. But do they talk about human relationships? No. That's where we have to start learning.
Yes, to have, this whole idea of that kids are interested in, or even if that's their developmental path, that to explain to them about sex is taking everything we've known and just throwing everything out, as if there was nothing of value in what all of our ancestors have learned. All the stories, all the poems, all of the games that kids play, that have been nurturing and developmentally appropriate. I can't, to devolve that into the most basic low denominator, sex, this is, this is a new bottom, I think, that we found in our society.
I agree. And we don't allow our children to be children because they're starting to teach them about sex when they're very young. And they should not be doing that. It's something that children should find out from each other. And that's always how it has been. And it's this idea, and I just remember there'd been of the boys that I was doing remedial, they'd all been in a class with sex lesson. And I remember one of the boys coming out looking so puzzled. And I said, well, what don't you understand? He said, I don't understand what they kept calling, women's, I said, vagina. He said, oh, yes. Because the children can't take that stuff in. They're too young.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not appropriate.
No, it isn't at all.
It's almost, sounds evil to me because it's just not, I don't know. What do you think?
Then I think the feminist movement is evil. I always said from the beginning, it was never a women's movement. That was the lie. That's what I call the Trojan horse.
Mm-hmm.
Because what actually happened, is that it went everywhere, right, as you know, right the way through universities and all the rest of it. But the point at the end of the day was that it wasn't about love and relationships and any of those things. It was about basic old-fashioned communist destruction of the family. And I kept saying, this is the planned destruction of the family. It's here, it's among us. Let's stop it. But people don't listen until it's too late. And now we're in a situation where, one of the things that happened is that, yes, I was a single parent mother. It's not anything I would recommend for anybody. But then it became, and very early on in the refuge, that if a woman was on her own and she was given the money from Social Security, but if she had a man visit, she'd lose the money. So they used to barge in the middle of the night, the social services, and go and look in the bathroom to see if there were two toothbrushes, check under the bed, check in the cupboard. Horrible invasion. And it frightened the children.
And do you think
it was all that? Sorry. Yeah.
So then the women wouldn't be able to go to negotiate with their husbands and find their way back to their negotiation with them.
If they found a man, even if he wasn't a permanent relationship or a husband, he would be expected, which is ludicrous because most of those men didn't even have jobs. All that would happen is that she'd lose her welfare.
Right.
And he could come back, but again, two of them without jobs. And no, it was very brutal, very brutal.
So the women would have come to the refuge to get out of a situation that they found intolerable and that was intolerable for them and their children.
Yeah.
But if there was any movement for a reassociation, that would be not allowed.
No, because the man would then be expected to pay for her and the children, even if they weren't his.
When bureaucracies get involved with families and with children, it doesn't go well.
No, it doesn't. And particularly family courts, they should be abolished. The most terrible things happen in family courts, particularly to fathers.
Yeah, right.
Because the law has been feminized, the judiciary, for 50 years.
Yeah, it is in Canada too, very badly.
Yeah.
And so, that's why men are shying away from marriage. It's no wonder.
Yeah, absolutely. And why wouldn't they? To know always that your partner or your wife only has to pick up a phone and you're finished. And she doesn't have to provide any evidence.
No, that's correct. Yeah, here too. Yeah, so it's everywhere.
It is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But then, if you go and look at the roots of it, it's been highly successful, hasn't it?
Yes.
The planned destruction of the family.
What we were talking about, the, Marxism, oppression, oppressed, and victimization, victim and perpetrator. That whole idea goes back to the Bible of Cain and Abel, and Cain feeling victimized because his offerings were insufficient. But then instead of thinking upon himself what it might have been, he blames his brother because his brother was accepted and becomes murderous.
Yeah.
And so, and this whole movement of feminism, of resentment, that's that movement of from Cain and Abel, that beginning of resentment that started one of the second story in the Bible. It's fundamental, right? Fundamental to us to know that.
It is, but also I think it's really important for people to recognize that you have to have the strength to be able to stand alone when you are surrounded by people who don't believe in anything except the material things of this world. And it's only faith at times that'll get you through. Certainly in my life.
Mine too. Yeah. Mine
and your
too.
husband's.
And my husband's. Yeah. Mine most recently. I think he was figuring these things out in his 20s. I was pretty headstrong. So it took me quite a bit longer. But eventually I figured it out. Or it came to me anyway.
I read about that because you joined the Catholic Church.
I have. I'm in the midst of joining the Catholic Church.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's everyone has been very welcoming to me too.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and that's really something, I think. You're talking about being that you need community. There's a community here. There definitely is a good community.
And that was true of the Refuges. It was quite funny because when I was endlessly taken to court, all the mothers from all over England, because we had houses all over England, they'd all turn up. And there they'd all be with masses and masses of them with their children. And that's our community. And once you came to the Refuge, you were community for life. So if anything happened to you, you could always come back to the ever open door of the Refuge.
Mm-hmm. Wow, what a gift. What a gift that was. And
yeah, so it was my favorite place. I loved it.
Is that why you got the award? Because you created this place of...
Yeah, I think so, because it was the first in the world.
And do you think people are doing a better job of it now?
No, because the feminist movement, as I said, hijacked the entire thing. And across the Western world, boys over 12 can't go into the Refuges. And men are seen as the enemy. They're seen as the patriarchal curse. And that's shocking. Men can't work in the Refuges. It's vital that good men are employed in Refuges.
Oh, and they can't work in the Refuges anymore?
No, they're not allowed to, no.
Oh, wow. Arrogance, the arrogance.
Yeah. Right. And also the fact that, the whole point of Refuge is healing. You're hurt, you're damaged, you're going somewhere where you can heal. And you need both men and women. It's really important. And it's interesting because there's the first man, one of the first men, was called Mike Dunn. And he worked in the house with me. Because it was really important for women, not just for me to work with them, but also for Mike, because they needed to sort out their relationships with men as well. And there was a great big ex-rugger player. He'd been a priest for quite a short period of time. And people would say, oh, Mike isn't a man, he doesn't hit anybody. I'd say, well, no, because he doesn't need to. There are other ways of dealing with frustration.
Yeah, and you have to see that. Kids have to see that. Women have to see that.
That's why you need men working in Refuges.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to pay attention to that. Well,
you just got to get the stranglehold, because we can't go on funding the women's movement because it's no good for children or for anybody.
It's no good for women.
To call men toxic, all men toxic, and boys. It's shocking because it's so untrue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you're not born. Sorry, yeah.
I interviewed a woman who was an English teacher, but she was also a feminist, and she was teaching in 2014. She'd been teaching this way for years, and she was watching the boys in the class, and then she realized that what she was teaching was destructive, and so now she's gone back through the history of feminism, back through Britain, and she's really rewriting the feminist mother's story to show the resentment from the beginning.
And that's right, and how dangerous it is.
Yeah.
And the thing is that what the majority of these women who call themselves feminists, they don't understand the history. They don't understand that they are actually acting out exactly what the communist movement wanted from them. They wanted to get rid of men out of the family, because if you want a totalitarian state, you can't have the family, because it's a unit. Men will actually die for their children and their wives. So you have to basically get rid of men as far as you possibly can. Then you can control the situation. Mm-hmm. And that's what a totalitarian state does. It controls.
Right.
It replaces you. Instead of the family, instead of the father, you have the state.
Yeah, right.
And it's proven disastrous in China and in Russia. So, I mean, it's about time everybody woke up and realized that this is a defunct movement.
So do you have any closing remarks to give to me?
I suppose that the only thing that you can really live by is love. And for me, it's faith, love.
Yeah.
You can only, what I learned, I suppose, you can only love people better.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Patience and love. Thank you very much for coming on my podcast. It was a pleasure.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I've loved talking to you.
Oh, thank you. And we'll put all the links that you have for your films and your books and everything. We'll put it all in so that people can find you.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for all your work writing all those books. What was it? The cookbook? What was that called?
Oh, the Sluts Cookbook.
You're so funny. And yeah, people would just like to read that because it's a very funny book.
Good.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and all the best to you, and congratulations on your award. Well deserved, I'll say.
Thank you so much. God bless.
God bless.
Bye-bye.